Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, despite experience, inviting me for a third time to this tremendous event. And I think it's a wonderful event in that it's a combination of, this year in particular, of looking forward in a sense with apprehension, but at least looking forward as well as looking back. And I think a lot, also looking widely, as yesterday's panel with John Horn and so on, looking widely at conflict in the revolutionary era, if you like, enables us I think, to think about the Irish Revolution and the experience of communities and individuals in a rather different way. Not to say, sure, there was hardly any trouble. I'm not saying that, but to think in terms of why it was that the political violence during the era we're talking about took the shape it did, and to some extent was confined to the patterns that it was. And that's even more greater puzzle if you look on the island of Ireland and try to measure, as I've been trying to do for many years, political violence by the very crude instrument of deaths. And it's a crude instrument because it's not necessarily a precise index of political turmoil or uncertainty or whatever. But I've been trying to measure with this project, the dead of the Irish Revolution, who actually died as a consequence of Irish political violence and why. And I was particularly glad when Liam spoke not only of the revolutionary era just now, but of the more recent Northern Ireland troubles. But even there, I have to complain slightly, not of Liam, but of all of us, that we do, both in terms of the revolutionary era and of the more recent Northern troubles, we do, it is an error for us all, and we all do it, to partition the island, right? Political violence in Ireland up to, I would say, well, till it more or less dies out, you would say, by the end of 1923, has to be understood in an all-Ireland context. And that is so whether you're in Belfast in 1922, a year after this Stormont has been established, or whether in your West Cork in April 1922, or wherever on the island you are. It isn't as though suddenly a different league was created, if you follow me, use the sporting analogy, when Stormont came into being. I think it's an error that we think this way. I think also the problem, for example, the term Southern Protestants. I was talking at the first of these festivals to a chap outside the door from Donegal. He may be here this year. Now he saw himself a member of the Church of Ireland, right? But Donegal, if you look at the map, you'd say, "Oh, geez, is that Ulster? Is that Southern? Is he and the family he sprang from, who experienced partition being on the wrong side as in their narrative of the line, are they now Southern Protestants? Right? They're in Donegal, for God's sake. They're next to Rockall, right? Do you see what I mean? And I think even the definition of Ulster was a shifting. They identified themselves as Irish and as Ulster Unionists. But Ulster was redefined at quite a late state definitively to become a 6-county Ulster, not a 9-county Ulster. If you look at political violence in Monaghan, both in 1920 and 21, and to a limited extent in the early 1970s, what you're getting there is a very Ulster kind of violence, right? I think there's a policeman killed in Ballybay, there's a policeman killed in Clonus, there's a special killed in Clonus while robbing a grocer's shop, because the specials came down, they were drunk, they were told not to come into Monaghan, they did, they carried out a robbery, the RIC came along and a special gets shot. But that's that's a very Ulster, Northern Ireland, even though Monaghan is on what side of the line? It's in this jurisdiction now. So I do think our rhetoric, we should be looking at the island. And even in terms of the Troubles and that fantastic work and uncontested work, Lost Lives, David McKittrick, Brian Feeney and others. When you read that, you have to read that, not simply as what happened in the North, but you have to read it in a wider sense, partly because even in this jurisdiction, there were killings and deaths arising, weren't there? From us, right? Primarily, a handful of people killed by the security forces here, rather more people killed by the Republican movement, and some people killed by loyalists. This is the single biggest death toll, as we know, during the Troubles. Was if you take the Dublin Monaghan bombings together, what happened, I say, in Dublin Monaghan in 1974. So we have to be careful with this So let's talk about the island, and I'm talking about the island rather than about the north and the south, right? Even though I am, of course, a southerner, and I'll get to that. Okay, so that's the first point I want to say. The second one, just picking up, if I may, on Liam's thing. Liam's that curious thing he extracted from Lost Lives about how many of provisional IRA deaths are, in a sense, at their own hands, right? And the interesting thing about that, for my study, is the comparison with the War of Independence. Well, if you take it from basically from 1919 to 1921. Because there, and in fact, there's a man with a website called the Cairo Gang who keeps finding more and more, to my great distress, more and more British Army casualties. They're all accidental. In the period we're looking at, and the figures I have for Crown Force losses, over 25% of British military deaths, which vaguely speaking are related to the Troubles, mainly in 1919 to 21, or what the British Army would casually call own goals. The result of accidents, typically arising from very young soldiers not taking the magazine out of the rifle, or taking the magazine out of the rifle and not taking the one that's already in the chamber to be fired, not taking it out and then picking up the gun and going, you Sinn Féin, so-and-so, bang. An extreme example of that is, if I may tell you this story, in June 1921 in Baldonnel airfield, an RAF lorry driver who'd been issued with a sidearm because lorries were being fired at a bit, he bet his friend, he held out a piece of paper, and he bet his mate that the friend couldn't shoot the piece of paper out of his hand. What happened? He won the bet. He got shot there. And that's the point about Crown Forces. In the War of Independence, they about a quarter, they also had vehicles. By and large, the IRA did not have motor vehicles. The police, who had about 13% of police deaths, by my calculations, are own goals of one sort or another, from suicide to accidental shooting, but to traffic accidents. The IRA lost almost nobody in a traffic accident because they weren't, they didn't even get the kick of a horse. They were walking. Right, sometimes they were cycling. I can think of one death in October 21 after the truce of a cycling death. So funny things come out when you look in detail at data, right? And I think to address again the question yesterday, the comparative question, and if we look at writing, there's a lot of analytical writing now about political violence within societies, divided communities and so on, particularly on the political science side. And it's always important, as somebody said earlier, to drill down and to look in detail at the local, right? Because and also to look at, paradoxically, at aggregate data and see what it means. Because we have to be really careful about generalization. And we have to be careful even about, I'll give you an example. Can I depart from the script I don't have? I'll take a date. 2nd of February 1921. Now I know there's a range of people, a range of ages here, but there's probably not somebody here who scarcely remembers that day and year. But to take what happened that day, there were 9 deaths, by my reckoning, arising from the Troubles, right? To take the first, a man of 58. He was a landowner. He was an auctioneer. He was a JP, a member of the Church of Ireland. He woke up to find that 2 men had broken into his house. There's a confrontation. There's a scuffle. He's shot dead. Right, so that's the first death, and we'll come back to him in a minute. The second death, there's a member of the RIC, a driver based in Gormanston in County Meath, but he's in Dublin for whatever reason, in civilian clothes, cycling on a road. An IRA man, because we have the report, happens to spot him and recognise him, shoots him, bang, just off Dame Street. Called Mulvaney, who's a Catholic. A man called Vanston, from Maryborough or Portlaoise, who's about 26 years old, I think, who's a labourer. He went to Glasgow for a while to work. I think he might be a skilled metal worker. He's back in Portlaoise. He decides, I'm going to apply to the police, and he writes a letter or whatever, fills out an application form, which is intercepted. He's on his way to work. His wife hears shouting. She runs out, and there's a man on top of him hitting him with a gun. She runs inside to get a hatchet to fight your man off. She comes out, unfortunately, it's too late. He gets shot twice. Bang, bang. The man concerned shouts, "You're never going to join the effing RIC." He cycles off on his bicycle. That man, who was OC of an IRA battalion, ended up as a guard, right? Which often was the case with IRA officers. Now, this man Vance is a member of the Church of Ireland, right? So why is he killed? If you were counting gross terms, you'd say Protestant civilians killed and an ex-serviceman. He was killed because he's an ex-serviceman or a Protestant, but he was probably killed because he was trying to join the police. Not that it was a pleasant thing. That's Vanston. Then you have 3 auxiliaries killed in County Longford in a famous ambush at Clonfin, where Sean McKeown and the local IRA, in total 4 die, but 1 dies the day following. And none of them, as far as I can remember, are Irish. Then you have can't remember where now, it might be, maybe in Offaly, you have an ex-serviceman killed called Jim Tormey, who's an IRA man. He's commander of the Athlone Brigade. You have in Dublin, you have a man named Campbell killed in a traffic accident. He's knocked down by an armoured car. He's Church of Ireland, right? And then in Armagh, you have a man called Orr Graham, who's a member of the Special Constabulary, who shoots himself. And he is, as far as I remember, also Church of Ireland. So what I'm saying is you couldn't use any one of those categories, like religion or whatever, as to be our ex-serviceman, to be sure why these people died. Do you see the point? Right? I mean, Campbell, in fact, a member of the Church of Ireland, is a salesman in an armoured car, crashes into him on Sackville Street. It's nothing personal, it's nothing religious, it's just bad driving and bad luck. But if you were to aggregate that as Protestant civilians, you might think, aha, do you see what I mean? And you'd be wrong. At least I think you'll be wrong. So we have to be careful. But go back to Dixon, member of the Church of Ireland and so on. Where does he die? One at a time. Where does he die? He dies in Dunlavin. Where is Dunlavin? Wicklow? How many people die in Wicklow as a result of political violence between 1916 and December 21? Look, if you had arthritis and couldn't move some of your fingers, you could probably tell us. I think it's 8, right? Might be 9. That's civilians, police, military. That's accidental, self-inflicted and deliberate. The RIC, you lose 4 in that county in the whole period. One of them killed himself in Dunlavin the day after Dixon is killed. Why? Because he was one of the guys who did the killing. He and another black and tan newly arrived in Ireland, so they aren't traumatised. They're not doing this because their mate was ambushed. Went out robbing, ended up killing this pillar of the community. He shoots himself. His mate doesn't kill himself. His name is Mitchell, I think. But he ends up being hanged, the only black and tan to be hanged for killing a civilian in Mountjoy in March 1921. Right? So you can look at it. So 2 of the deaths in Wicklow are associated with a crime against somebody who, if you were looking at it in the aggregate, say, well, there's another member of the Church of Ireland. Maybe it's because he's a rich farmer and a Protestant and so on. Well, it was probably because his house looked rich, but in a sense was nothing personal. The people who did it were policemen, newly arrived in Ireland, who were bad sorts, right? And they paid for it. And on we go. If you go down to Jim Tormey, who's an IRA man who's killed in an ambush. Tormey had been, at something like 16, he had been made a lance corporal in the British Army, till his father wrote in and said, he's too young, you shouldn't have let him in. So he's actually pulled out of the army and comes back to Ireland. So he's an ex-serviceman who dies, but he's also IRA. Do you follow me? So in all these things, I'm making the point that you have to be really careful, which is why we need very detailed study, as we're having done now in Cork with the Cork Fatalities Register and so on, as we're having done in Tipperary, where huge work has been done at a local level. And the work that's been done at a local level is enormously important, and it's not just collecting, which are very important. The stories that your grandmother had are the ones, the tales that weren't told and so on, right? That's part of it. But also there is fantastic amount that can be captured locally. And very often, we heard of this earlier, it's not just the killings. My problem is I'm looking at deaths. So I'm not looking at, for example, people who are intimidated but not killed. I'm not looking at whole categories. But even in the narrow categories of death, very often you have to dig down to find local narratives about it. And when you do, of course, you don't get the true story. Right? Let's be clear about this. My great-uncle, Paddy Maloney, was killed on 1st of May 1921, just outside Tipperary town. He's adjutant of the 4th Battalion, 3rd Tipperary Brigade. He and his OC were killed on a family farm outside Tip by the RIC, right? The report says acting on information received. Okay, so I have the British documents on it. In fact, the report also says they killed Jim Maloney, my grandfather. They didn't kill him, as you can see. I'm here. Their father was the TD for Sinn Féin TD, but the actual information received 2 weeks later. On the same farm, a farmhand is dragged out at night by men in coats, long coats, in front of his heavily pregnant wife. She was carrying twins. He's dragged out, John Brophy, and shot dead. I had that. I knew that. I'd read reports. I'd read the pretty cursory British Military Court of Inquiry, who said, mysterious men. It was taken, there was obviously the police shooting him as well, right? I then found, a local historian sent me interview notes he had from the 1960s with a man called Sean Fitzpatrick, who became the OC of the 4th Battalion after Duffy was killed with my great-uncle Maloney. And he said what had happened was Brophy was killed. This is what he told the researcher in the 1960s. You know why? Because the RIC were afraid that if Brophy thought about it, he would realise that he had been the inadvertent source of the leak, because he had said something in a house in the town, oh, the boys are outside, and the leak had gone from the house in the town. So that was a nice story, in a sense, for the Brophy family. And in fact, his mother's grandson, his wife's grandson, his wife who married in America, I sent him that story when I heard it. Then somebody else got on to me and said, oh no, I'll tell you a story about why Brophy was shot. Right? That story is, well, blah, blah, blah. It was a big, this man I know when he was a little boy, he saw them drag him out. One of them had a big moon face. It was Dan Breen, and the IRA killed him. So you don't get, do you see the point? You don't get a definitive, cross my heart to be sure version ever from the local, right? But you do get a depth and so on that you're not going to get from official records, right? And if we think in terms of the, for example, discussion, at best, when we have discussions of the Kilmichael ambush, which is rare, it is talked about and shrieked about a lot, right? But no matter how much material you find, you're going to find contending versions, not only in the records, not only in the scholarship, but in the locality and sometimes within a family. But it doesn't mean it's not worth going there. And I think where we've been very lucky as communities in the last few years is not simply in terms of a natural interest stimulated by centenaries in the past, which has resulted to some extent within families sometimes, with some people eliciting, bits of stories and things that weren't there. But on the Irish side, we've had this fantastic abundance of new material emerging. First of all, the Bureau of Military History, problematic but very valuable. And now the pensions records, which I was lobbied for a long time to get released, which are enormous. Now I mustn't be ageist, but I can see on average here, you all nod approvingly when I mention pensions, but a lot of young people don't get it, right? But the pensions records are amazing, partly because they're created much closer to the events than something like the Bureau of Military History, and they were never intended for posterity. And I'll give you an example of the power of some of them. The killing of a man called Harrison, not in Cork, a small farmer, a Protestant in Leitrim, which took a year from when he fell out of the IRA because they wouldn't pay them an arms levy, to a period where a local Protestant clergyman intercedes. They give him back his best cow, which they'd taken. He gives them £1 and he gives them a gun. But they reckon that he has another gun and they want it. And he says, no, I haven't. And it goes on and on. In the end, the police get to hear of it. They decide he's now an informer and they kill him. And one of the men who did it writes quite a moving account. He goes into Harrison's house. The party are there. they force him to give up the gun that turns out he had. And then they say, he pleads with them, "You don't kill me, don't kill me." And he says, "I'm sorry, we have our orders, we have to do it." And he ends by saying, I told him, they said, we told him to go outside, and he ends, "I told him to bring no coat," right? This is really powerful. Other people are not going to need a coat, mate, because, you're not going to be alive for long. And of course, the Harrison family up to the left. And you're getting an amazing wealth of that kind of material, sometimes very disturbing, right? And very often, sometimes quite reflective. And very often with a tinge of, I won't say remorse necessarily, but you're getting people reflecting on things they've done and wondering about the impact on people and so on. It's not all I killed. It's not all the bombast of someone like Tom Barry. You should all bless yourselves, of course, when you mention Tom Barry here. Or else do that. But or eat some garlic. But but what I'm saying is the records of the revolutionary side are getting richer and richer and richer. But what we miss, and what's very hard to find, are two things. There's far less. We had the Irish Grants Committee material mentioned, although that's a collection of insurance claims. You have to be careful with insurance claims unless you're making them, right? But we don't have remotely the same depth of people, of records from people on the other side, both of people who suffered political violence and of people within the police and the military who practiced it. I know of almost no, for example, memoirs by loyalists who did a lot of stuff, particularly in Belfast in 1920 and in 1922, right? So where's their folk history? If there's no East Belfast equivalent of, West Belfast and the Public, whatever. But whose grandfather or great-grandfather decided, there's that house, that street is full of Fenians. The best way to deal with it is to go in there, shoot a few and burn the houses down, as happened. But where's their history? Do you follow me? I think that all I'm saying is that for those of us as historians, but also as family people, there is this mismatch which is increasing between different kinds of histories available on the nationalist narrative and all the other things. Not only histories of pain suffered, we get a bit of that through compensation claims and so on, but also of things done, right? Because certainly in our unpartitioned Ireland, there was a lot of not necessarily simply security force, but there was a lot of political action, political killing, which wasn't done by Republicans. It wasn't done formally by the state in the period certainly up to the end of 1922. Anyway, now I'll can I start now? Okay, can I just say to begin, I think I was very glad yesterday and this morning David Fitzpatrick was mentioned. I'm sure you remember he spoke here 2 years ago. And it's very interesting, David, as well as being a terrific historian, was an outsider to Ireland. We must remember that. So in some ways you could argue he didn't have the emotional baggage. He didn't have, as Mary Murphy's granny, Mary Murphy yesterday mentioned her grannies, I'll mention mine in a minute. He didn't have any of that stuff. And it is interesting that nevertheless he has in some quarters been treated as though he was almost a political agent, as though he was almost distorting history in the interests of discrediting Irish republicanism. And that's, there's a difference between historiography, if you like, and histrionics. And I think a lot of the debate about the Irish Revolution, particularly in Cork, and particularly, I have to say, from Cork, tends to be as much histrionic as historiographic in nature and so on. But anyway, we should mention David. Secondly, I mentioned Mary Murphy yesterday and her grannies. Again, I'm probably typical of many of you in this audience, right? I don't know. My wife got me last year to do my DNA with whoever it is. It's ultimately the Mormons or whatever. So presumably, means in the next life I'll have 7 wives or that, whatever it is. And I'm almost in total. I'm 90-something% Irish. I'm sorry, right? And 1% Viking or Norse or something, and the rest 8% British. But if you look at my DNA, because the other point about the West Cork, you wouldn't say this, of course, this is considered by its critics sometimes called the West Brit History Festival. It's kind of posh and so on. And so as it's posh, I'm writing the equivalent of Debrett's or whatever about my family. And as a historian, it's actually quite important. Just to explain my family lines, I do have blue blood in me, in that my grandfather was a Garda sergeant, right? But I also have emerald green, because before he was a Garda sergeant, he was an IRA officer in County Down he was one of those who had to leave in April 1922, because the alternative, as his brother-in-law found when he went back, you could get interned indefinitely. The case of my down Rice for 2 years. So at least but my great grandfather, that man's Halfpenny, his name, of course, what was he? He was in the RIC. Or were his two brothers? They were in the RIC. And this isn't that unusual. I mentioned Tom Barry, son of an RIC man. Martin Corrie, who ran the nearest thing to Auschwitz that the IRA managed, or anyone else managed to produce in 1920 and 21 in the Cork No. 1 Brigade, the son of an RIC man, a head constable, and so on. So I'm in good company in that. On my mother's side, I mentioned Paddy Maloney, my great uncle. My great grandfather was a member of the First Táil, P.J. Maloney. My grandfather was an officer in Tip, and then on Liam Lynch's staff, his brother Con was deputy chief of staff at the end of the Civil War, which didn't mean as much as it sounds. So I'm well mobbed up in terms of republicanism. Now, I knew very little about most of this as a kid. You know why? Because my whole family narrative was dominated by my grandmother's, Cathy Barry, by her narrative, in which she excluded herself, who's a very dynamic, important figure, but in favour of her dead brother Kevin. So even within a family where you're very historically minded, right, what tends to happen is whoever the memory holder is, it's they who decide what gets focused on and so on. But having said all that, so what I've been trying to do as an historian isn't primarily to look at family history, but it's to look at the wider history of the Irish Revolution and simply to find out how many people died and why and by whom did they die and so on. And as I say, the figures that surprised me most were particularly that so many British military, over a quarter, died by their own hands for one reason or another. But other things, other elements, and if we come to the police, I mean, it is easy in some ways to be very sympathetic towards the RIC, and certainly I as a researcher and so on, when you read their records, when you see what happens, when you read the accounts of their deaths and so on, it's very harrowing and very striking. It's also in some ways a testament to them. It's perfectly clear. If you want to find a monument to the RIC, and I know there's disputes about that, you know where you'll find it. You'll find it in the Phoenix Park. You'll find it in Union Quay. You'll find it in the Bridewell. You'll find it. It's the Garda Síochána. That police force, in some way, is in some ways so like the RIC, which it succeeded, with the important exception that by and large they didn't carry weapons. It's almost uncannily so. Now, I know the police Garda have had their troubles, and there's issues about restructuring and so on, and modernisation and all that kind of thing. But it seems to me that by and large, the relationship of the Irish people, the public, with their police force, which is by international standards unusually accommodating, that predates the creation of the Garda Síochána. I think it was a reversion to what, in quiet times, and particularly in not disturbed areas of the country, was the way that policing had evolved. And it wasn't quite policing by consent, but neither was it policing, say, on the French model. I wouldn't say that in France, because I'd probably get CS gas thrown in my face. But by and large, it's very clear that for whatever reason, nationalists as much as Unionists Ireland had been accustomed and had grown to take for granted a kind of policing, which the RIC by and large delivered outside Dublin. I say outside Dublin because when we talk of the War of Independence, there's a chronic organisational problem in policing in Ireland. You have a semi-national police force, not a national one. Dublin is the centre of the conspiracy, if you like, from the British point of view. against British rule in Ireland, but the policing there is done by what is really like a British or a Scottish county force, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. And so you don't have integrated policing across the country. I think the narrative of the war, of the Irish independence struggle, would have been very different had you had a unitary police force, but you don't. So when you look at the police, what questions arise? Well, one is how many died and so on, where they died, why they died, right? And again, that's obviously very striking. By my figures, now the great expert here, Jim Hurley, is, I won't put the figures up because he would say, no, you're wrong. If I can find them. Well, I'll show you the figures in a minute. But just to say, in 21 out of 32 counties, from 1917 to December 21, there are less than 10 police deaths, right, from all causes, including accidents and suicides. In Cavan, there's one. In Swanlinbar, and there's a lot of trouble over it locally. Almost nothing happens in Cavan in the War of Independence. Whatever, perhaps it's really too expensive or whatever. In Leitrim, there are 2 deaths, one of which is a kind of, it's argued, is a kind of suicide, in that a black and tan had been wounded and supposedly tore off his wounds because he was drunk. In Meath, 2, in Carlow, 3, Kildare, 4, Tyrone. Tyrone has 4 deaths, 4 police deaths, including specials. There's this. Westmeath, 4, Wicklow, 4, Louth, 5. So where you happened to be sent as a policeman, be it as a regular RIC man, be it as a black and tan, it made a lot of difference where you got sent, right, or where you happened to be stationed. The most dangerous place to be a policeman. Now, we're doing this by county, not by population, and there are issues because we use the county to measure these things, but some counties have a tiny population, some counties have, like Cork, have an enormous population. So there is this difficulty. But anyway, by my reckoning, we have about 2,345 deaths in total of all kinds and all categories, of which the police, of all kinds of police. They're primarily RIC, but there's a couple of Belfast Harbour policemen, there's some Ulster Special Constabulary, and there's some DMP. But by and large, the RIC become the principal target, if you like, of the IRA. I don't think there's any question about that. They're the symbol of state authority. And they're also, as we all know, they're the ones that any Mulcahy or any of the IRA leadership would say, they're the ones that you had to attack, because they represented the state and the power of the state. I was, on Friday, on the way down, I was interviewing the son of a man in Tip, whose father was OC of one of the brigades in Tip, and who in you'd say the first police assassination, I'd say, in Ireland took place. It wasn't under his watch because he had just come out of jail in Thurles in June 1919 when Inspector Hunt is killed. And that's a deliberate assassination. That's the first time they set out to kill a policeman. During the 1916 Rising and after, by the way, which was an interesting period, about 485 people killed, the majority of them civilians. But anyway, in 1960, there's no targeting of officials. They don't shoot you because you're a political detective. Do you see what I mean? There's no targeting whatsoever. Policemen get killed, but that's in the course of battle, if you like, or in the case of in Cork when they go to arrest David Kent, the Kent brothers, and so on. But by and large, there's no targeting whatsoever on the basis of your position and your expertise. And yet in 1919, there's this quite sudden shift, right, particularly initially in Dublin, where people are killed, not just to go out because they represent the Crown or anything, but because they represent a kind of knowledge and expertise that you want to eliminate, right? And so we know the IRA start doing that. They do it in Dublin, but they also do it in Tip early on. In March 1920, I think it's in Templemore, where this man's father was the OC and did organise it, they shoot a policeman called Luke, this is Finnegan, I can't remember his surname, but they shoot him because he's collecting information and so on. But he's also known locally as the Sugar Man. Why was he known as the Sugar Man? Sorry? Because during the war he'd been in charge of sugar rationing, of seeing who got what. So he's a very connected figure. He knows everybody, as most of the RIC did, because if they weren't doing the sugar ration, they were giving out spray for whatever plague was about, or they were doing the agricultural census or whatever. So the police were really plugged in to rural Ireland. Whether you liked them or not, you had to deal with them. And so they're obvious targets. So the IRA set out to kill him quite early in the conflict, as it were. Not because he shot somebody, but because they regard him as aggressive and they regard him as collecting information. So there's a strategic decision at local level. But that in turn, within a couple of months, two you could say, one definitely IRA, one sort of young Shinner, are dragged out and killed by what was called a police murder gang, right? And so what happens to the RIC? That this is before the TANs come in, before the auxiliaries, that they said that suddenly it is somehow, I won't say acceptable, but it happens that they say, okay, we're not taking this anymore. We know that your man and your man, we'll go and plug them. Not beat them up, not, make their lives a misery, we'll go and kill them. So there's a very dramatic transition is what I'm saying, not just from more radical enforcement of the law or use of new powers or so on, but where did the message come from that it was suddenly this is something you could do and get away with? I don't know is the answer. I do think it's partly to do with the higher organisation of the RIC. Throughout 1919, there's bitter policy debates, if you like, within Dublin Castle especially, as to what the direction that policing should take and how this emerging, but not necessarily all that problematic nationalist and separatist surge is to be dealt with. And ultimately, if you like, if you want to find a sort of a hero in it, the Inspector General, Sir Joseph Byrne, a military man brought in after the Rising, the first Catholic head of the RIC, but he says, look, we cannot continue to police on the basis that we're being asked to do so. First of all, our men are sitting ducks, distributed across the country. They have limited protection and so on. Secondly, the military won't work with us in any strategic way to target known troublemakers, to carry out searches properly and so on. But he said, and thirdly, we're going to, at some point, the government is going to have to deal with Sinn Féin. Right? So he argues you can't simply lock up the whole country, you can't simply whatever, and the failures of policy are going to result more and more in my men becoming the focus of resentment and attack, which is what happened. Now, what happens to Byrne is that by the end of 1919, he's pushed out by a clique within Dublin Castle. Even the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, says, oh, well, he struck me as able and intelligent, but wanting in drive or whatever. So when Byrne goes, by and large, what happens is the leadership is passed to a man called Smith, who's a run-of-the-mill policeman who had run Belfast for years as an RIC officer. But somewhere the word goes out, it seems to me, even before General Tudor comes over in June 1920 to shake things up and to get tough. The idea that the police can retaliate, not officially but unofficially, had begun to gain traction. Because there are, increasingly in 1920, there aren't that many, but certainly in mid-tip, as I mentioned, in Louth, bizarrely, in Roscommon in 2021, there's no doubt that there were what were called murder gangs operating. Because the police are going out and shooting people, either in revenge or to put manners on the local rebels. Do you follow me? We're not talking about big numbers, but it's such a dramatic shift in the psychology of policing. And the problem is, of course, to document it and to explain it, rather than to excuse it or whatever. And the difficulty there, John Regan, a district inspector, did write a memoir, and he makes the point in his memoir, as these killings start to arise, in Limerick as well. He says the point is that you can't say that this is just the TANs, who don't know any better, or the auxiliaries, because they wouldn't know. I came here, I eventually got here on Friday. I don't know how, because I used Google Maps, right? At least the authorities didn't have Google Maps to confuse them. But how would you, as a soldier, looking to go and, kill somebody at dead of night, how would you find them, right? And the only way is if somebody brings you locally not through well-lit Euro-funded superhighways or whatever, to the back and beyond, to the right house or nearly the right house, and there's no electricity, whatever. There had to be, even where we know that the auxiliaries killed people in this way, we know that the army killed people in this way. There had to be local knowledge, and that local knowledge must have come to some degree from some elements in the police locally, which is an awkward thing to say. But I think it's worth saying. But the difficulty is to document it. John Regan says, I say in his memoir, but it's very hard to find more evidence on it. So what other points do I want to make? Well, if you want to know, roughly speaking, my figures for police deaths, in Antrim, for example, which on paper is by the third most violent county in Ireland, I've warned you the county is a hopeless measure of units, but it's the only measure we have, right? There are a total of 18 police fatalities, not all caused by Republicans. That includes suicides and accidents or whatever, even though that's the third most violent place. So the police were not, with the exception of two, if you like, targeted attacks by the IRA in Belfast, the first of which resulted in 3 nationalists being killed that night in police raids. The police, by and large, in Belfast aren't part of the general struggle. Neither are the British military as targets. They do kill a lot of people, the British military in Belfast in 1920 and 21, but they do it on a sort of an impartial basis because they fire on rioters. And all rioters, in a sense, look the same, right? But to go down, Armagh, counties that become, you would say, the cradle of the troubles that we've mostly lived through, where just absolutely almost nothing happens, as measured by death, right? For a complex of reasons. Carlow 3, Cavan, well I said 1, at Swanlinbar. Clare, which is a small county, 34, and Clare, as you know, got violent very early. In March 1920, the RIC in Clare, in the course of dealing with public rowdiness and riots in Milltown Malby, they opened fire and they killed 3 people. It's amazing. I don't know why, or I know there's a lot of local lore and local history on that episode and in Clare generally, but it tends to come very much from Republican sources. But as to how and why, it's hard to explain. In Cork, I have 102, the figures, we can debate the accuracy of those figures and so on, but that's the figure I currently have. Donegal, again, northern county, a southern county, 8. 8, and I could do them by from memory. County Down, where my grandfather was theoretically vice brigadier, there's 6, right? Dublin 67, Fermanagh. I mean Fermanagh. Don't tell Arlene, but Fermanagh. In the War of Independence, the big new thing that happens at Fermanagh, as you know, in the war is Rosslea. Is it February or March 1921, right? Where the IRA come in, they set out to kill a number of specials. They end up actually killing 2 or perhaps 3, and burning their farms. That in turn, that was the Monaghan IRA. It was a retaliation for the burning out of Catholic houses thereafter. Rosslea lives in the memory locally, right? There's different. Have you been to Rosslea, Fermanagh? Do you? Well, how do you spell it? There's 2 spellings. Yeah, exactly. I mean, but the point about Rosslea is it's clear from the pensions records that while it was by and large the Monaghan IRA who did it, the people who brought them were locals. And if you look at the mid-1930s at the lists of the Rosslea battalion, or their company probably, whereas if you're looking at a Mayo IRA company, their addresses in 1930 something are generally in Brooklyn, right? Because they are Kerry, they're all gone because of emigration. In Rosslea, they're all there. So the people are there, and in a community where everybody knows, it's touchy enough. Anyway, don't tell Arlene, as I said. Galway 15, Kerry 39, Kilkenny 4, Kings 8, of which most happened at the very end. Leitrim 2. As I mentioned that, one thing. Leitrim was where decisively the RIC, if you like, defeat in inverted commas the IRA, if you do it on terms of body count and general effectiveness. Limerick 42, including there's astonishing engagement at Drumkeen, where Donegal Hannigan, who didn't write his memoirs and never made much noise about himself, but he leads an extraordinarily effective ambush on an RIC column at Drumkeen, where he kills, is it 12? 11 or 12, and they miss 2 because they're in civilian clothes, and doesn't lose anybody. Now, is that better than Kilmichael? Of course not. Couldn't say that. But it's more effective, certainly. And on, Derry 9, Longford 15, Louth 5, Mayo, these are small numbers of deaths by and large, right? There's a few counties where the RIC get hammered, and where they do a certain amount of hammering. But there's a large number of counties where casualties are relatively light, and where casualties inflicted are relatively light. But there is a paradox, this issue of targeting and of indiscipline. I mentioned Vanston from Portlaoise, a county, I say, where about 11 people in total die. In Abbeyleix, I can't remember what date in 1921, a publican is woken up by 2 men bursting in the door, come upstairs, they kill him, and they're looking for a drink. And one of them drops his gun, which is how they're traced. And they're two black and tans again, right? Now, as I say, they're doing this in a place, Abbeyleix, of which doesn't feature. Do you follow me in the revolutionary narrative? There had been no atrocities, nothing had happened, right? But yet, in discipline, which is what General Byrne, one of the reasons he was pushed out, was he said you can't bring temporary soldiers, you can't bring temporary policemen in because you won't be able to control them. Right? They'll be indisciplined, and their indiscipline will spread. And these 2 chaps that say kill the publican are probably so drunk one of them drops his gun, which is how he's traced. And they are both convicted and sentenced to death, but they're saved by the treaty. So what I'm trying to say about, and I don't say it of all the RICs, the phenomenon of 2 things. One is of indiscipline associated, particularly with the tans, and to some extent the auxiliaries, and the sanctioned brutality, because the British cabinet, Lloyd George and Churchill, were urging them on to be tough, not to sit in their barracks, but to get out there and you know where these people are and you show them what's what. This is government-sanctioned terror, if you like, rather than the contrary. But also the sheer indiscipline. I think it needs more exploration than I've been able to give it so far. And why the pattern? As the pattern, it doesn't. What I'm saying is a lot of these acts, individual acts like the killing of Dixon in Dunlavin, don't map onto general trouble in the area. They don't map onto the personal experiences of the people who did them, the policemen who did them, and so on. They map onto the problem in those areas that you're bringing in people with no discipline and no training, and they're being told you can give the paddies, you can treat them as whatever way you like because they're all sort of bad, even they're all untrustworthy. But you have the separate problem of why it is that regular policemen, and it's only a few, and it's only a few instances, but it's important in terms of certainly of the politics and the propaganda, if you like, of the War of Independence, do decide the way to fight fires with fire, right? The way to do this is we'll go and we know who the local troublemaker is, or we know who his father is, which is nearly as good, or his brother if he's not at home, and we'll go and get him. And just finally, I'll say in terms of a dimension, not a fatal dimension, of official reprisals and police reprisals, which I've mentioned, arises from the issue of somebody mentioned Protestant houses being burnt and so on. I think that's very important that we look at this in an all-island context, but I think we should count other kinds of houses as well. If you want to see where my grandfather, Jim Maloney, grew up, you go into Tipperary town and the corner of Church Street and what I think is called Main Street. It is the Main Street. There's a sort of a civic space there with a statue of the Maid of Erin. The Maid of Erin, you find lots of Maids of Erin around the place even today because it's to commemorate the Manchester martyrs, right? Alan Larkin and O'Brien. But behind it there's a plaque which I spoke at the unveiling of to the Maloney family. And the point is the plaque is there because that's where my grandfather's house was until when? Until the 14th of November 1920, when three masked men broke in. And my great-grandmother wrote in a letter, which I saw a very bad photocopy of many years ago, I must try and find the original, she wrote, "They were wearing masks, but I knew them." And she adds, one of them was in our house every day because it was a pharmacy. You know, so she writes in indignation. Now her sons were all IRA officers. Her husband was a Sinn Féin TD, and there'd been an ambush outside the ground. Ironically, her youngest son, by her first marriage, was in the RAF, but that's Ireland for you. But his house, that house was burnt to the ground, and also, shock horror, the premises of Sir Thomas Lipton, who wasn't involved in any way in any ambushes, was collateral damage. And that again was done by not only by TANs, but by regular police. Now, whether they were justified or not is another matter. But in terms of public opinion, and in terms of the politics, if you like, of reprisals, it's hardly a wonder. So I'll just end, if I might end this rather rambling discourse. We know now, particularly because of Jim's work and also Richard Abbott, we know how many police of all kinds died. Now, the police of all kinds, I say, because it includes specials. My number is 523, Belfast Harbour Police, Dublin Police, and so on. We know, what amazes me is the variations between counties. And it's not explained simply by the overall level of violence, because Antrim, as measured by deaths, is very violent, but yet the police numbers are relatively small. And so on. We've a lot of historical material, increasing amount of material on the revolutionaries themselves, right? But we're still lacking those from the other side and those families and so on who suffered. We've plenty of evidence that to some extent the police, if you like, what many RIC men saw as the destruction of their role, their proper role in Irish life, does come to some extent from a top-down order, from the idea that which goes back, of course, to Winston Churchill. Had many good ideas. In June 1940, you know what Churchill proposed? Brendan? He proposed an Anglo-French Union, right? A federated Britain and France. But that's by the by. But Churchill, as you know, was very keen on the idea of having an aggressive semi-military, paramilitary force, both of turning the RIC into an aggressive paramilitary force and of augmenting them as they did with what became the auxiliaries. But there's a top-down sanctioning to get murder by the throat, right? To have none of this nonsense and just be tough with Sinn Féin, even though in parallel to some extent negotiations are beginning to happen, and most people in Whitehall, in London, just as much as I suspect in the higher reaches of the revolutionary movement, realise we're moving towards a deal. Yeah, but I've made the point about the murder gang. How can I end? We're going to have a discussion, aren't we, about commemorations and so on shortly. I would argue that ultimately, notwithstanding the land war and other areas where in parts of the country the police were very unpopular, the paradox is that the model of policing that the RIC embodied was that which was not only exported elsewhere, perhaps for good or ill, but it was also in effect that which was largely copied by the new state. And the fact that it's copied by the new state suggests two things. It suggests, all right, they had to, maybe they just by default took the existing model, but it was also that the existing model clearly had a high level in certain circumstances of communal acceptance. I don't think otherwise. You can explain matters otherwise, but because the Garda Síochána is so like, or was, of the 20s and 30s, so like the force which it succeeded. It can't simply be. And yet, as we know, it's not only myth. The Guards were so immediately accepted. Liam Lynch writes at one point in the Civil War, I haven't decided yet what to do about the Civic Guard. Right? If he'd any sense, he would probably have said, well, you shoot them first, even if they're unarmed. Right? Because the country was crying out for people for what, in a sense, the kind of services, if you like, the RIC had by and large provided for most of the time to most of the communities, and which it also provided a fantastic picture to central government, who didn't always listen, but of political feeling across the island, not only in Southern Ireland. And on that inconsequential note, I'll end. Thank you.